So, thank you everyone for joining. The topic of today's talk is: did ancient India have democracy? The brief answer is yes. But does the world know about it? The short answer is no. Why did that happen? And that is the question that we are going to answer today in light of Sri Aurobindo's birthday, which was on the 15th of August, which also happens to be India's Independence Day. Now, many of you would know that Sri Aurobindo has written this wonderful book called The Foundations of Indian Culture. And in this particular book, he addresses the discourse of a British journalist by the name of William Archer, who in early 20th century wrote a treatise where he trashed the Indian tradition, the Indian culture, the Indian history, Indian literature, Indian arts, uh, Indian sciences, and so on and so forth completely. Many of you would also know that Arthur Avalon, John Woodruff, who was in India at that point in time, addressed this question. And in his opinion, he thought that it was not necessary to counter William Archer. Sri Aurobindo thought it otherwise. And what Sri Aurobindo did in a series of articles that got published in Arya was that he challenged the contentions of William Archer and in the process explained to us what India has been through the ages. Fundamentally, he addressed the question: what is the foundation of Indian culture? How has the culture progressed over a period of time? What were the foundations of the traditions? You know, what is the literature uh, that Indian civilization has seen or experienced? What are the things that have been addressed in those pieces of epic literature, and so on and so forth? Now, in that same collection, he also wrote 4 chapters on Indian polity, because William Archer made the claim that Indian polity since antiquity has been hierarchical and oppressive, and that the Indian people have not known democracy worth the salt. Now, in a certain sense, William Archer was only reflecting a discourse which was put in place in the early 19th century by an individual by the name of James Mill. I've written this book which came out last year. It's been published by Paul Graham Macmillan, and it is titled Colonial Discourse and the Suffering of Indian American Children, where I have quite meticulously shown how the discourse which James Mill had put in place in the 19th century is reflected in current textbooks of children here in the United States when they discuss India and Hinduism. You'll be surprised. This is quite an expose. And in this process, what I did was that I went into all the writings of James Mill. I do not know how many of you know that James Mill was the father of John Stuart Mill. And James Mill was the mentee of Bentham, the father of utilitarianism. So James Mill basically stands in between two giants, Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill. He is the connect. James Mill's contribution in shaping the British society are enormous, but unfortunately, they have not been spoken about as much. And as I told you, the fundamental reason is because he got sequestered between two giants, Bentham and John Stuart Mill. I don't need to shed much light on Bentham, but briefly, Bentham was quite concerned about the hierarchical and oppressive British society that he had experienced in his youth. He was trained as a lawyer at Queen's College, but as luck would have it, he was not able to have much success as a lawyer. So he turned to writing. And in his vigor of youth, he thought that he would produce some marvelous literature and the society would transform. But unfortunately, power does not work that way. And Bentham, as an individual, as a character, was very sage like. He was not an extrovert at all. He was producing all these pieces of beautiful literature, but things were not really moving forward. Most of his literature were actually produced in the late 18th century. There was a chance meeting that happened between Bentham and James Mill in 1808, and that began to change and shift the situation. Now, before I come to what happened, through this collusion of Bentham and James Mill, as far as the British society is concerned, let me give you a brief background into the biography of James Mill. James Mill was born in Scotland. He came from a very humble background. Now, interestingly, his mother had an aristocratic background, but his maternal side had lost aristocracy in an uprising that had taken place in 1748 by the name of Stuart Uprising. So James Mill's mother was definitely familiar with this background, but she was married to James Mill's father, who had a shoemaking and shoe selling business. And James Mill's mother was not interested in James Mill inheriting that business. She wanted him to become a gentleman, meaning she wanted to regain her aristocracy through her son. And as destiny would have it, James Mill was a precocious child. He was very good in studies. And his precocity was recognized very early by the local aristocrats, the Stuarts. John Stuart Mill gets his name from the Stuarts, the local aristocrats who took a liking for James Mill and basically took him under their wings. The Lady Stuarts' idea was to prepare James Mill to become a preacher. And that is why James Mill was not educated at the local university, which was the University of Aberdeen. Instead, he was educated at University of Edinburgh, from where he did his bachelor's and master's in divinity in 1797. After he completed his master's, he looked for a permanent position as a preacher for the next 5 years, but he was not successful. He could not really find a stable job. Now, interestingly, there was another thing that had happened. Romance had blossomed between the daughter of the Stuarts and James Mill. And because of James Mill's humble background, there was tremendous objection, on the part of the Stuarts, and they prevailed. The wedding did not take place. She was married into the family of the Forbes, interestingly. It's very fascinating background to this. This history is quite amazing. And while James Mill was looking for a permanent position in order to support himself, he was also teaching the children of the aristocrats. And at many different places, he was humiliated. So there was this anger against aristocracy that he carried. Now, in 1802, he decided to move to London to try his hand in journalism. So he traveled to London, on a carriage uh, with the aristocrat Stuart, and he was able to find, positions with various journals and newspapers. That fortunately happened. London was a city of opportunities at that point in time, and he was very, very quickly able to find, uh, a job as a journalist. James Mill also was politically motivated. So basically, he would go to the House of Commons and watch the proceedings that would take place in the parliament over there. Working for a particular newspaper, he started manning the India desk. Now, there's another piece of history that you would want to know, and this is quite interesting. In 1784, there was a research institution that had been established in Kolkata by William Jones. The agenda of this research institution was basically to understand India through the translations of its various texts. So the translations began, and after the Asiatic Society was established in Kolkata, there were others also that came into existence in Bombay and Chennai. It was Madras at that point in time. There were many Europeans, in India at that point in time as well, and they were writing their travelogues. So, you know, there was this information, which was flowing from India into Europe. And it was a very good business at that point in time. And because James Mill was manning the India decks, he started writing reviews for those pieces of literature that were traveling from India to Europe. Now, around 1806, he decided to write the history of British India. The reason was that he was finding all these pieces of information on India quite disparate. And being politically motivated, he thought that the literature that he would produce would be very helpful to the East India Company in the governance of India. So, this was something which he decided in 1806. It was in 1808 that this meeting with Jeremy Bentham that took place. Bentham took a great liking for James Mill, and very quickly James Mill became the chief disciple of Bentham. Because of his journalistic inclinations, what he started doing was that he started simplifying the ideas of Bentham and began taking them to the masses. This is a very unique contribution of James Mill in the spread of utilitarian ideas that people are not familiar with. So he wrote and wrote and wrote quite profusely, and this utilitarian reform movement culminated in the parliamentary reforms of Britain in 1832, where, for the first time, representational democracy in modern times was introduced in Europe. You know, uh, this change that we are talking about, this revolution that we are talking about, was spearheaded by James Mill and a few of his other disciples who were known radicals at that point in time. So this is a major contribution that James Mill has made uh, in the life of Western world. Not only Britain, I would say, or Europe. It's the entire Western world actually owes um, to James Mill as far as the introduction of representational democracy is concerned. Now, to take the story forward, in 1814, James Mill was invited by the editor of Encyclopedia Britannica, Macqueen Napier, to contribute some articles in the supplement to Encyclopedia Britannica, which was going to come out. So, between 1815 and 1824, James Mill wrote a series of articles for the supplement to Encyclopedia Britannica. Now, let me come back, to the history of British India. So, when James Mill had decided to work on the history of British India in 1806, he had thought that he would finish the book in the next 3, 4 years and would continue with his life. But destiny had some other plans. A lot of things happened in between. The history of British India was published finally in 1818. And this particular work began to sell like hotcakes. Now, let me very briefly tell you about what the history of British India is. The history of British India was published in 3 volumes initially. And in the first volume, there are 7 chapters on the Hindu people and on ancient Indian history. It is for the first time in an institutionalized way you find a comprehensive denigration of India, where he liberally calls India and the ancient Indian people savage, uncouth, barbaric, rude. Think about as many synonyms as possible of uncivilization and savagery, and you will find them used against the ancient Indian people and ancient India. And his his main focus was to basically describe the ancient Indian people as hierarchical and oppressive. So, under the canopy of uncivilization and savagery, his chief motif was to describe the ancient Indian people as hierarchical and oppressive. This is basically what it was all about. So when you go through the 7 chapters, you find the the Indian society described as hierarchical and oppressive. Uh, the ancient Indian governance described as hierarchical and oppressive, its taxation structure described as hierarchical and oppressive, its social laws that you find in the numerous dharma shastras as hierarchical and oppressive, and so on and so forth. It's a beautiful piece of hate literature, if you will. That's basically what it was. Now, because of the popularity that James Mill received through the publication of this book, he was hired by the East India Company in 1819. He became one of the officials uh, of the East India Company. And by the time it was 1823, James Mill became the second in command of all the officials who were working at the headquarters of the East India Company in London, India House. He became the second in command. And by the time it was 1830, he became the chief at the India House. In a certain sense, these are some facts that are not known, and it's important that we know about these facts, because James Mill was not a mean figure. You know, his contributions uh, for the entire civilization is quite enormous. When I look at his contributions, I feel that he needs to be knighted as far as the British society is concerned, and he needs to be thoroughly, critically examined in terms of the Indian situation. Both of these things, unfortunately and incidentally, have not really happened. So let me come back to this story. In a certain sense, you can say that James Mill became the CEO of the East India Company. Why do I say this? When you look at the hierarchy of the East India Company, above James Mill, you only had a court of directors, which was presided by a British parliamentarian. That's about it. So, this history of British India that James Mill wrote basically became the manual for the transformation of Indian society. This is a part. This part of the story, I will narrate some other time. Because what what James Mill did in the transformation of the Indian society is quite enormous. But today, I'm just going to talk about the impact that the history of British India had in terms of the representation of India, not only in India but also in the Western world. The history of British India became the template through which India continues to get represented. And when I use present tense, I'm saying this with a certain sense of responsibility, because I'm seeing that in academia quite significantly. This template was picked up by the Oxford University Press and the Cambridge University Press. And you'll be surprised that this template is followed still today. James Mill, through another individual by the name of Macaulay, was able to bring about educational reforms in India, which led to the undermining of the Indian education system in vernacular languages. And English, was imposed on the Indian people. This happened in 1835. Now, 1850s onwards, universities began to get established in India. And what was taught in those universities was basically the things that James Mill had written. This is it's a very long history. I will basically cut this short. Now, there's an important piece of expose that needs to be revealed, and I have revealed that in chapter 4 of my book, The Colonial Discourse. You would remember that I spoke about his writings in the British context as well. So when you put his India writings next to his British writings, you find a massive correspondence. James Mill never went to India to write its history. James Mill wrote India's history sitting in London. That's what happened. Now, when you put his British writings against his India writings, you find this correspondence in the sense that, when he's talking about, let's say, the Hindu Brahmins, he's actually talking about English clergy. The utilitarians had a massive gripe, with English clergy. Why? Because the war cry of the utilitarians was the greatest good for the greatest number. How was that going to come about? That was going to come about by dismantling the existing governance structure, which was uh, which was comprising of very few people within the British context who were holding power, and that consisted of, in the sequence that I'm talking about: aristocracy, monarchy, and clergy. James Mill went massively after aristocracy and clergy, and he had his reasons. He had his personal reasons. He was not allowed to marry into the family of the the aristocrats, and he was humiliated in his younger years by the aristocrats. He tried and tried. He could not find a job with clergy. So, you know, the objective situation in Britain at that point in time became subjective for James Mill. And that is why he wrote quite strongly against them. So when you compare these writings, what is it that you find? That when he is talking about the Hindu Brahmins, he is basically talking about the English clergy. The language is surprisingly very, very similar. When he's talking about the Hindu Kshatriyas, he's basically talking about, the British aristocrats. When he's talking about the Hindu form of governance or the ancient Indian form of governance, he is basically talking about the existing form of governance which the utilitarians ended up transforming. So this entire discourse on India is imaginary. It is pure imagination. And this gets revealed, as I said, earlier, when you put his India writings against the British writings, and this is what my book is all about. Now, because of the power that James Mill came to wield in the world context at that point in time, his imaginary discourse on India became the reality. And this was the discourse that, William Archer picked up, say, almost 100 years later. There is a wonderful correspondence once again between what James Mill writes and what William Archer writes. And therefore, there's a very intimate connection, between what I produced, last year, looking into the writings of James Mill and the refutations of Sri Aurobindo. So I spoke to you about, the falsehood and the imaginations. Now, what was the reality? What was Indian governance like? And this is what I'm going to uh, speak on, for the next few minutes. Sri Aurobindo, in those 4 chapters on Indian polity, is quite categorical about the fact that India has had democracy right from the very beginning, and he has provided evidence for it. Of course, it had its own brand of democracy, and that democracy also had has changed over a period of time. So what he does in the first chapter on Indian polity is uh, that he takes us to how the situation was during the Vedic times. So in the Vedic times, the collectivity was very small. The collectivity was known as Visha, and the Visha would have something by the known of by the name of Samiti. Before even the Samiti was formed, all matters related to governance and social existence were decided through vote. At that point in time, there was no leader. The concept of leader had not really emerged. Then the concept of leader emerges. And when the concept of leader emerges, it was not hereditary. The lead, the monarch, if you will, was was not decided through through the hereditary principle. The individual was elected. Much later, when the position became hereditary, even then the consent of the people was important, for the individual to have his sway, over over the collectivity. Now, within that collectivity, that this grew this body by the name of Samiti, you know, which had elected representatives from the collectivity that we spoke about. This is something, which you find in the earlier stages of the Indian form of governance. Fast forward, republics came into existence. And and because it was a republic, the leader was chosen. Where is the evidence for all this? When you get into the biography of the Buddha, you would learn that his father was the leader of a confederate of republics. The matters, for governance, they were decided through debates and voting. This was part of the Indian form of governance. It was an integral part of governance. Now, around the time when India was attacked by the Greeks, by the Macedonians, basically by Alexander, that was the time when a shift happened uh, towards the monarchical form of governance. And this shift was instituted by or initiated by an individual by the name of Chanakya, who has written this book called the Arthashastra. You know, Many of you would know that the Indian social life was divided into a few quadrants. One of them was Artha, Dharma, Kama, and Moksha. You know, Artha basically means, the pursuit of material wealth. Kama, pleasure. Dharma, I don't need to explain. Maybe I need to do that, but it will be a different presentation. And moksha. Now, for all these categories, you had texts. For artha and kama, interestingly, just one text in each category remains. For artha, you have the Arthashastra of Kautilya, And for Kama, you have Kama Sutra of Vatsyayan. The Upanishads are basically moksha shastras. You know, they are compendia for teaching the path of moksha. And then you had the Dharma Shastras and Dharma Sutras, which were basically for social governance. So you had text for all these categories. So it was around the time that Arthashastra was written that the transition from a majorly republican form of governance within the Indian context shifted to monarchical form of governance. Now, even in this monarchical form of governance, Sri Aurobindo says that the format was not what you experienced in Western Asia and in Europe, because democracy was an integral part of the governance here as well. What is the format that Sri Aurobindo talks about? Sri Aurobindo talks about the ruler. Now, interestingly, we have had many queens as rulers, as ruler as well. This is something which is not commonly known. Now, around the ruler, you had a council of ministers. This council, interestingly, had representation from all the four varnas, from all the four jatis, the castes. What is the the normal representation that you find? You find that Indian governance, and this comes from James Mill, uh, you know, comprised of uh, an hierarchy where the Brahmins and Kshatriyas, in collusion, ruled the roost, and they oppressed the Vaishyas and the Shudras. But the reality was very different. The reality was that even in the council, or rather in King's Council, you had the representation of all the four castes, including the Shudras and the Vaishyas. Around the ruler and its council, you had two bodies. They can be called as Metropolitan Assembly and General Assembly. These are the terms that Sri Aurobindo has used. Now, in both these bodies, you had representations from all the four varnas. And the people who came to these assemblies were elected representatives. In the Metropolitan Assembly, you basically had people coming from the cities of the kingdom, including the capital of the kingdom. In General Assembly, you had people coming from rural parts of the kingdom. And most of the decisions of the king, or rather the ruler and its council, had to be vetted by these assemblies, by these two assemblies. Now, this is something, which is not known. And this is basically, what I wanted to talk about. Usually, the social political writings of Sri Aurobindo are not discussed much. There's a new interest, I would say, in his writings. And as people start investigating, you know, the ancient Indian tradition, truth is beginning to come out. There's a lot of literature, which is still extant as far as ancient India is concerned. And the things that Sri Aurobindo stated are getting validated through and by evidence. I would like to uh, emphasize that the yogis, they develop the capacity to look into past, future, and present simultaneously. And that is why within the Indian tradition, there's a term which is used for them. It's called Trikal Drashta, somebody who's able to look at three aspects of Kala or time simultaneously. So, with that, let's open it up.